Our democracy depends on keeping elections safe. But in recent years, law enforcement and election officials have been working in an unprecedented climate. They face rising election related threats, intimidation, and harassment. The 2022 election cycle was marked by a complicated array of threats. Survey data following the 2020 presidential election found that 30% of local election officials said they were personally abused, threatened, or harassed because of their job. Responding to threats and preventing violence are critical to keeping our election sites, as well as election officials, volunteers, and voters, safe and secure. But this new climate raises new challenges for elected leaders, elected officials, and law enforcement agencies alike. These challenges arise all across the country, in jurisdictions big and small. Sheriff Paul Penzone of Arizona's Maricopa County, one of the largest voting jurisdictions in the United States, as well as Chief Chris Davis of Wisconsin's Green Bay Police Department, weigh in on successful tactics and critical steps law enforcement can take to ensure that elections are safe and feel safe in your city and county.
My name is Paul Penzone. I am the sheriff in Maricopa County in Arizona. I've been in law enforcement for about 30 years. I'm here today to talk about Maricopa County and how we deal with this crossroads that is public safety and elections, something that traditionally law enforcement may have played a part, but never to the significance that we see today. And in Maricopa County, I think we dealt with it at a level that was unprecedented across the nation. In 2016, Arizona for the first time became relevant on a national scale. There was just kind of this bubbling up, this escalation of potential for civil unrest and violence. And in 2020, what we saw was bad behavior becoming contagious. 10, then 50, then 100, then a couple hundred, then 1,000 people collectively growing outside of our tabulation center. And the reason this was occurring was because the presidential race was going through Arizona. And suddenly there was immediate unrest and this growing energy that people didn't like the outcome and they were going to take it into their own hands. I, as a law enforcement leader, felt really committed that if we didn't say we're not moving on this and public safety is attached directly to democracy, that what could occur in Arizona would be very detrimental, not just locally, but nationally.
I'm Chris Davis. I'm the chief of police in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I've been in this role for 2 years now. When I got here and in the lead up to the 2022 elections, I could tell that the stress level for a lot of the people responsible for elections here locally was pretty high, just based on what had happened in 2020. Just given the tension and the energy around elections that we were seeing, I felt like there was a lot of potential for us to have legitimate public safety issues related to elections, either at polling places or related to the administration of elections. Preparing elections and when we're planning on how we're going to keep elections safe, it's really important to take into account what impact we might have on people's feeling of safety. And in some communities, the community wants to see uniformed police officers at polling places, for example. In others, like ours, they really don't, because that can have a chilling effect for some voters potentially. And we don't want to impact the outcome. We just want to keep the election safe. And so it really depends on your community. For us here in Green Bay, we felt like we needed to have less of a visible presence and have more of a behind the scenes plan for how we would deal with anything that came up.
This is 2020, and 2020 really was the first kind of explosion, we could say, of Arizona being relevant, local and national interested parties suddenly feeling like this is the place that they wanted to be. And this is an image of what we call our MCTEC, our tabulation center, where all of the votes, the physical votes, end up and that they're counted by volunteers and employees.
We weren't surprised that this was going to be ground zero. We knew that all the eyes throughout the country are going to be looking for us and what was going to be happening through the election that night. So naturally, it was getting a lot of attention from both local advocates as well as national advocates, and that was going to bring the crowd. So priority was to keep the peace, preservation of life, but also maintain the sanctity of the election process itself and everybody's rights that were there that evening. One of the things that's most concerning to me is this is a ballot truck. These are trucks that are bringing in hundreds of thousands of ballots from the 232 different polling places throughout Maricopa County. And we're bringing this truck through this crowd. Had they known, and depending on their intentions and their motives, obviously this vehicle is escorted and there's some other assets in and around this vehicle that you can't see. But had they turned on this vehicle, what would have been the detriment to the election process here in Arizona?
Yeah, I believe there was approximately 15 trucks that were coming from around Maricopa County delivering the ballots, and it was a layered approach, as you talked about. You can see that we have the marked escort, we have the undercover escort, we had air support going on at the same time, ensuring that these ballots are brought in safely.
What we learned here versus what we did in 2022 is considerably different, because in 2022, we used horses to clear the streets and to send a message of how serious we were to use a unique tactic and a unique resource to manage crowd control. We had drones up flying everywhere, which we'd use some here, but we really took it to a whole nother level. We had more spotters on all the rooftops, and we used a helicopter as not only a resource to keep an eye on everything, but a deterrent.
So one of the big obstacles that we realized early on, or big problems I would say that we needed to solve for, was that we knew that we would have police officers potentially going into situations where there was a dispute that hinged on some matter of election law. And we don't usually train our police officers on election laws. We're more familiar with criminal laws and procedural laws and the rules that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so one of the things that was really important for us was to make sure we educated our police officers who were going to be working on election day on Wisconsin election law. For example, we worked with our city clerk's office to develop just a one-page information sheet on election laws, like an election law digest, so that they could have just a quick reference guide to look at on the day of the election to say, okay, this is how far away somebody has to be from a polling place in order to engage in campaigning activity or whatever the question is. And that way, at least if our police officers get sent to one of these situations, they know what the rules are for elections.
I need my people to be successful. I need them to be successful to speak a new language that they weren't speaking the day before. We don't 365 days of the year enforce election law. It's far and few between. So we had to make sure that we rehearsed and clearly understood the laws as it related to that space and taught our deputies how to implement it, how to deploy those laws, how to engage people in that space to make sure they're successful. So I have people that are still people with rights, U.S. citizens going out there and they're worried about the election, but their decision making on how they're doing it imposes its will potentially into a space that is unlawful. And now I also have people who want to cast a vote. And the last thing that they want is to feel any impediment on their way to just drop off my voice through this vote into a box and be on my way back to my normal life. There's a lot going on emotionally in that space. So when we talk to our employees about how we're going to handle that, first of all, let's handle it with caution. Secondly, handle it with conviction. And most importantly, know your job. Know where your authority begins and ends. Know what the law is as it relates to this unique space. And make sure that we respect everyone involved and help them be successful.
Another thing that I thought was really important and I think really paid dividends for us in 2022 and certainly will into the future is having a good relationship with whoever your election official is. In our case, it's the city clerk. And our city clerk and I have a great relationship because we work together all the time as just members of city staff. But having that relationship in advance enabled us to have just real conversations about what the issues were, what the vulnerabilities were, what their concerns were. These are folks, especially in our clerk's office, who aren't used to kind of living in the stress level that we in the police world are used to.
Green Bay is like many other places. Our poll workers' average age is probably 70. So they're very concerned about people being angry. And so what the police department did was to provide the poll workers with some really excellent conflict resolution, de-escalation training. So yeah.
Mitigating disputes between people is something we get to do a lot in the police department, and maybe you don't as much in the clerk's office. So we were able to hopefully provide them with some tools that they could use, again, just to give them that extra measure of confidence that even if something happens, I have some tools I can use to try and work it out.
Right.
I'm the Maricopa County Recorder. My office is responsible for recording public documents, voter registration, and the early voting component of Maricopa County. And Maricopa County has about 2.5 million registered voters. We're the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, behind only Los Angeles County. We make up about 62% of the voting population of Arizona, which is really unique among election jurisdictions. And you obviously know just what an outsized role that Maricopa County has in the state of Arizona. I think Paul was one of the first people to reach out and say, hey, welcome aboard. I'm here to help you in any way that I can. And that was just so comforting. And I can't imagine election administrators throughout the country who don't have that type of relationship. It must just be so much harder.
And I appreciate that. I didn't expect that we would. I mean, I wasn't surprised just because all the electeds in the county at some point in time will interact. But it's uncommon that law enforcement would be thrust into the space where you're just trying to fundamentally run an election and determine an outcome and care for, the community when it comes to democracy. And then it became a situation where not just for you, because I realized how direct the impact was for you personally, but all of your staff and the volunteers who had to come into this place, and you're trying to coordinate that work while also figuring out how they can feel safe coming here when safety should never have been a consideration. It should have just been the given. Because I'm working with stakeholders, these are people that I'm going to have a personal relationship with, and I need to respect who they are, that they're elected officials with responsibilities, and that their job is no more, no less, no different than the importance and the value that I see my job as, and I have to respect that. And if you start that in the premise of your relationship long before there's an event, I think you're better equipped for success. They faced death threats. Their families were in the crosshairs, and that's unforgivable. It's unacceptable. And I made sure that they understood, because of my responsibilities and my authority, I was going to protect them personally, literally protect their physical being as well as their families, their homes, so they could do their job. And it seemed as though, although we had a friendship relationship collegially, that when they understood my commitment to care for them personally, their confidence in how I would handle the circumstances in the physical spaces where they had the authority, that there was more trust built. Do you feel like on the other side of it right now, and granted there's another election around the corner, that what you were able to accomplish set kind of a standard going forward, so you and your team are more equipped, or do you feel like it was a setback?
Well, one of the metrics that I would use to assess that is we've got a lot of people who have come back. A lot of temporary workers who worked the 2022 cycle are back working today for our jurisdictional election. And so I think that's testament to the fact that they felt supported in a hostile environment. They felt safe in a hostile environment. And so I would love to see them back for 2024.
I try my best to be a person who has this privilege of being a sheriff, to always think about leading by example. And I recognize I'm speaking to everybody out there right now that we're all predisposed in some way on how we feel about things in our world, whether it's politics, religion, whatever is important to you principally. And I know that I'm going to ask the men and women in this organization to do something that fundamentally they may not agree. They may feel a certain way about the outcome of the election. They may feel a certain way about the process or the candidates. But I can't let that affect how they do their job. So what I have to do is lead by example by understanding that and then finding a pathway to bring them along and not force them into a space. So, for me, it was important that they understood how elections work, that they saw the volunteers and the employees and the men and women who count the ballots, and that they come from all walks of life, politically and otherwise. They need to see and feel and smell and touch the idea of redundancies in that process to ensure the outcomes are credible. And then they need to recognize what their commitment is to the community. And what I would do is I would go through the tabulation center on a daily basis, once or twice, the weeks leading into the election. Ballots were already coming in. And what I would do is I just wanted to interact with the staff inside the building and those responsible for the outcome of the election, counting the votes. But I always invited my staff to come with me. By walking through there every day with a few different employees, they suddenly felt invested. They felt like a stakeholder and empowered to understand why we were doing this, and to gain confidence that what we were doing was for the right reasons. We were protecting something not only of great value, but of great integrity. And every one person that you can influence in the right manner tells 10 others who believe in that individual, and suddenly it becomes a contagious process through the organization. On the flip side of the coin, it also gave confidence to those that were in the building. They saw us as people that just happened to be wearing uniforms and badges and guns, and it didn't feel militaristic. It felt very, very human, very relational. So we built a bond within our organization, and then we extended that bond to those who were responsible for this, so that we felt in a cohesive space that we were all on the same mission. And that was to protect the reputation of Arizona when it comes to how we handle elections.
So as we got closer to the election and we had identified what a lot of the potential risks were, then one of the next things that we did is we got a group together for a tabletop exercise, and it included people from the police department, myself, the mayor, some of his staff, the city clerk who administers our elections, and some of her staff, and then some folks from the city attorney's office. And we just strategized about different potential scenarios that could come up in our election. And that was really helpful for two reasons, really. One was that it got us thinking about how we would respond in real time if there was a problem related to elections, but it also exposed some gaps that we didn't realize that we had, and gave us some time to think through how we would close those gaps. Some of the concrete things that came out of our tabletop exercise were plans to reroute calls for service from polling places so that they were dispatched right away, coordinate public communications about the election throughout the day through press availability, a management plan for any protest or counter-protest activity, an emergency evacuation plan for City Hall and Central Count.
In Wisconsin, in Green Bay especially, we have central count, and we also have ballot drop-off. And so what happens is we have our poll workers who've worked 14 or 15 hours, and they're basically bringing the ballots back here to City Hall. And you identified that was a conflict point, and so it was great what you came up with.
Yeah, we decided to just secure part of the parking lot to give them almost a landing zone, just to come in their car and have an area where people couldn't approach them, or so there would be no risk of somebody getting access to ballots, just not only to maintain the physical safety of the ballots, but also so people can have confidence that nothing happened to those ballots on their way down here.
And preparing for this, it requires a lot of tabletop, it requires a lot of training, it requires a lot of multi-stakeholder collaboration. So the county attorney's office, the prosecutors, the recorder's office, the board of supervisors, the sheriff's office, all came together to discuss what we hope to accomplish and whose responsibilities fell into what lanes. We wanted to make sure that all the stakeholders in this community that were directly involved in some way, shape, or form in public safety and elections work together, and that it was a cohesive and fluid process. And we had to educate the people that worked at the polling sites, so they understood they could be the first line of de-escalation before law enforcement engaged. And law enforcement's first step would be something in soft close, and then we would escalate there if the person was uncooperative in something you see uniform. Because the last thing that we want to do is go within that 75-foot space, which by law in Arizona you can't impede in law enforcement to potentially influence voters. So if we're going into that space, we had to have the lawful authority and the need to do so. We wanted to make sure we respected that. So everybody on the team, which was the recorders, the supervisors, the prosecutors, the sheriff's office, others, all felt like we had a voice and we had a stake.
I think one of the most important lessons looking ahead for 2024 is if you haven't started planning for the 2024 elections in your community, you might want to start right now. We expect that in the current climate that we're living in, it's just a reality that this is going to be a public safety event, and it's probably going to be a bigger one than even the 2022 midterm elections, because there's more on the ballot. In 2024, there's a national presidential election, and so we know that we will have some of the same potential risks to our elections in 2024, and we've already started planning.
Safety is what I do, and I've always been this believer that the three pillars of dealing with a potential threat of violence is time, distance, and barriers. So when I look at time, I say, how much time do you have to prepare? How much time do you have to evaluate information that could potentially provide you with enough knowledge of what you may face? How much time do you have to train your people? The further in advance you start preparing, the more time you have to find the flaws and correct them. Distance is, to some extent, fundamentally, it's physical in nature. How do you keep that potential threat as far away as possible from where they want to do harm? And can you use physical barriers or technology or people to extend that distance, understanding what the law allows you? Because I can say, listen, I want you 10 miles away. But if the law says you can be 10 feet away, then I'm going to have to deal with that. So understanding your distance leads to the next element, which is barriers. Barriers are fences, barriers are barricades, barriers are vehicles, barriers are horses, barriers are people, barriers are doors. I know I'm saying barriers a lot, but I'm trying to emphasize why this is so important. You need to ask yourself, what is the appropriate volume of potential barriers that I can utilize to keep that threat from its target within reason? And when I say within reason, this is still a free nation, and democracy is predicated on the idea of freedom. We don't want this to be a situation where everything that we do is necessarily encased within walls, but there are places and spaces where walls are necessary, or fences, and those are business decisions, and you're gonna have to own them. You're gonna have to own them as a law enforcement leader, because you're gonna have to ensure that your community understands why you made that choice, and that in the end it was the right decision. And we're not gonna get them all right, but you can't fear getting it wrong, as long as your decision is because you're trying to protect people and democracy.
Chief Davis and Sheriff Penzone helped illustrate some key lessons that will be helpful for any law enforcement leader to keep in mind as they prepare for election season. These include: train your department in election law. Your officers don't enforce these authorities every day, and these authorities also change, so give your officers a refresher. Building a relationship with your election officials. These folks will be key in helping you to identify security gaps, ongoing threats, and community sentiment. They may also need your help with security for themselves, their staff, and their facilities. Leave personal politics at home. Convey to your team that personal politics have no place in public safety. This is especially true during election season. Let your department know that to protect and serve during election season, it's vital that you pursue your work and remain apolitical. Help your team understand the why. You swore an oath to the Constitution to be a public safety professional. Successful policing during election season is about upholding the very essence of that oath. Free, fair, and secure elections are what our country is all about. Hold interagency tabletop exercises. These can help ensure that your department is on the same page as every other official who will be responding to critical incidents during election season. Finally, start planning early. These are complicated events to plan for. They're sensitive and the stakes are high. You will set yourself up for even greater success by giving yourself ample time. Contact information and resources regarding this episode of What's New in Blue follows.